Sometimes it's easy to forget that video games do not exist within a bubble, and that the industry is subject to change from external and internal factors. Those external factors could be changes in other industries, changes in the stance of regulatory bodies towards a particular acquisition by a company, or towards a particular game or genre. There are also the internal factors that I mentioned, like changes in software or hardware development, changes in demographic, changes in trend and taste towards a particular genre of game. It's all very, very fluid. And the best thing that you can do if you are the person in charge of a software publisher or a software or hardware developer is to try and future-proof yourself, I suppose you'd call it, for the next 5 to 10 years, given the rate at which technology has been advancing over the last 5 to 10 years. The problem is that you've then made a prediction for the future of your company and indeed the industry that may end up proving to be wildly inaccurate given the rate at which technology is advancing. A prime example of that is the sheer difference between Nvidia's 4000 series graphics cards, which have just been released, and their previous 3000 series just one generation ago. Anyway, I digress. Let's crack on with the show. Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome to Gossy News, where we take the choicest cuts of video game news, coat them in a layer of opinions, and then sear them on a bed of hot takes. Before we carry on, if you like what you hear in this episode, then please do consider clicking that like and subscribe button, ringing that notification bell. It does help us grow as a channel, and it does allow us to reach more people. Now that the preamble is out the way, let's crack on with our first story, which is that Blizzard and Netease have ended their 14-year partnership, and that from January, certain Blizzard titles will no longer be available in China. So before we get into this, a little bit of context. Netease is a Chinese company, and since 2008, they have been handling the publishing duties for a variety of Blizzard titles like Diablo 3, Hearthstone, Heroes of the Storm, Overwatch, all the StarCraft titles, Warcraft 3 Reforged, and World of Warcraft. You'll be wondering why Diablo Immortal isn't on that list. That's because that is co-developed by Netease and Blizzard and is covered by a separate agreement which will not be affected by this breakup. Blizzard has said that it will cease all new sales of these titles in the coming days, but the upcoming releases of World of Warcraft Dragonflight, Hearthstone March of the Lich King, and Season 2 of Overwatch 2 will continue as planned. So there's this bizarre situation where these games are going to end service on January the 23rd, 2023, yet you could still buy them and their expansions all the way up until that point. NetEase's CEO William Ding has said, "We have put in a great deal of effort and tried with our utmost sincerity to negotiate with Activision Blizzard so that we could continue our collaboration and serve the many dedicated players in China. However, there were material differences on key terms and we could not reach an agreement. We hold high regard in our product and operational standards and abide by our commitments to Chinese players." Blizzard, on the other hand, said the two companies could not agree on a deal that was consistent with Blizzard's operating principles and commitments to players and employees. Many who run in video game circles will be aware that China works differently to the rest of the world when it comes to publishing video games. If you do want to publish your games in China, you need a Chinese publisher. The problem is that Blizzard have now broken off with NetEase, and finding another publisher to replace them is going to be a long process. It's going to be drawn out, it's going to be scrutinized by the Chinese authorities a lot more heavily than the original agreement that they had with NetEase back in 2008. And the reason for that is because the Chinese government has been cracking down hard on the video games industry. So here's the rub. Activision Blizzard absolutely do need to be trading in China because they have a lot riding on them being part of the biggest video games market by value in the world. But the ripples from this are far-reaching. Number one, it will have an effect on their share price. Number two, it will have an effect on regulatory approval of their acquisition by Microsoft. Maybe not a major impact, but it will have an effect. Number three, and possibly the most important, according to Daniel Ahmed from Nico Partners, which is an organization that exclusively researches and analyzes the video games markets and consumers in Asia, if Blizzard does partner with another Chinese game company, its games would need to re-enter the approval process under the new operator.
However, there is an expedited process that operators can utilize. For example, when Warframe switched operators from Changyu to iDreamSky, it was able to utilize this separate approval process, which is also used when a game's name needs to be changed or an additional platform needs to be added to the license. Blizzard may turn to Tencent, which partnered with Activision Blizzard to develop and publish Call of Duty Mobile in China. Tencent, with its strong distribution channels and experience of operating foreign game franchises, is likely the sole logical partner for Activision Blizzard to replace Netease. On the flip side, Netease has claimed that Blizzard's games represented low single digits as a percentage of its total revenue, and they've also said that the expiration of these licensing agreements will have no material impact on their financial results. Unfortunately, markets don't really work in the way that you want, and people still make predictions, and a breakup of Netease and Blizzard will have an effect on Netease's share price as well as Blizzard's. Might not have as much of an effect on Blizzard because they have the takeover by Microsoft in the pipeline, but it will have a marginal effect. But that's not the only effect that this breakup has had on Netease. The boss of Netease, Simon Zhu, has hit out at Blizzard in a post on LinkedIn. He says, "As a gamer who spent 10,000 hours in the world of Azeroth, StarCraft and Overwatch, I feel so heartbroken as I will no longer have the access to my account and memories next year. One day, when what has happened behind the scenes could be told, developers and gamers will have a whole new level of understanding of how much damage a jerk can make. Feel terrible for players who lived in those worlds." Now, many people have speculated that the jerk in question may be Bobby Kotick, but we don't know. What we can surmise is that this isn't a new decision from Activision Blizzard. It's probably a couple of years old, possibly even predating the decision by Microsoft to buy Activision Blizzard. If that's the case, then it's entirely possible that Activision Blizzard have already laid the groundwork for them to start working with a new publisher, possibly even Tencent, so that there will be a minimal disturbance of service come January. We'll have to wait and see. Anyway, we're going to stay with China because Chinese state media have done a U-turn with calls to deeply explore the value of video games, and Chinese gaming stocks have surged following the publication of a particular article in the People's Daily. This article is called "The Opportunity to Dig Deep into the Value of the Video Game Industry Mustn't Be Lost." Now, this editorial in the People's Daily suggests that there is an alternative way for the Chinese state to look at video games, and recommends possibly following the example of Europe and Japan and South Korea, Canada, Australia. They have accelerated the distribution of video games. They have focused on the industry being a target of development. And later on in the editorial, it does suggest that video games could be a tool for exchange and innovation. And it also suggests that the sector could be a way to project soft power in the same way that South Korea has latched onto K-pop, TV and movies to influence the wider world. It's very similar to how Japan has come to influence the wider world with anime and manga, and also to a degree through J-pop and J-rock. And it's very possible that China could be the country to do it through video games. They do have such a long history, and they have a wealth of folklore and legends that they can draw upon for the creation of video game content. The editorial isn't all sweetness and light. It does end with caution by saying, of course, video games cannot evade the problem of addiction, and all parties need to pay special attention to this. With the refinement and implementation of anti-addiction regulations, China's games industry has gradually bid farewell to barbaric growth. Now, that's kind of a reminder that the People's Daily is a state-owned newspaper, and they will basically toe the party line. But the rest of the article does suggest that there is a slight softening on China's stance towards video games. That's something that might be serendipitous for Microsoft and Activision Blizzard in terms of Activision Blizzard getting a new publisher, and in terms of Microsoft getting some good games out of China. They are trying to plumb the depths of Chinese video games, after all, just like Sony is. I think the Chinese state has noticed that there has been this stagnation of the Chinese video games industry because of their hard line. Newzoo have put out a report which is called China's Gaming Regulations, analysing the consumer and market impacts of Chinese games market policies. Newzoo always do some really interesting reports, and this is amongst one of the more fascinating ones because it's dealing with a market that a lot of people don't have a lot of external insight into. Rather than going through all of the numbers with you, I'm just going to be very, very brief and jump straight to the conclusion and let you read the rest of the report yourself. They do end by saying entering China's market is risky, but there are still many opportunities. Regulations can be unpredictable, but many companies are leveraging unregulated markets and workarounds. Now, I'm not suggesting that Activision Blizzard are going to use any of the workarounds. I think they'll have a formal agreement with another company. They do state that gamers always find loopholes, but they stress that this isn't the best way, and if you do get caught, there will be punishments. I'm going to leave that to one side. We're going to move on to something slightly different, but sticking with Activision Blizzard, unfortunately. They were in settlement talks with the US Justice Department over an esports antitrust probe, and those talks have actually broken down. So, what's this all about? Well, it's a probe that dates back to July of 2021 and the Call of Duty and Overwatch leagues. In those leagues, Activision Blizzard introduced a competitive balance tax. Now, the Overwatch League originally became a point of concern for the Department of Justice because there was a lack of a players' union which would have allowed the Overwatch League to apply for a non-statutory labour exemption. That's a status that has been granted to the NFL, NBA and other pro sports leagues in America, all of which have labour unions. It's an exemption that goes back to 1965. I'm not going to go into the history of it. Suffice to say that during the investigation, Activision Blizzard gave the Department of Justice a load of information. From all of this information, the Department of Justice discovered that Activision Blizzard had introduced this competitive balance tax to the Call of Duty and Overwatch leagues, and apparently this competitive balance tax was in breach of antitrust regulations. So now you're up to date with everything that's going on with the Overwatch and Call of Duty leagues. Let's stick with esports because Team SoloMid, who are one of the biggest esports companies in the world, they're also known as TSM, and they are consulting legal counsel over the FTX bankruptcy. They signed a $210 million sponsorship deal with the cryptocurrency exchange back in 2021. Now, as people may already be aware, the collapse of the FTX cryptocurrency exchange was massive, it was rapid, and the repercussions are going to be felt for years. Suffice to say that a lot of people have lost a lot of money, some people have been left with virtually nothing. Individuals and organizations are going to be scrambling to recover from this. TSM is apparently in a relatively good place as far as things go. The company have said that they remain stable and profitable, but there is still a long-term deal in place and an awful lot of money unaccounted for that needs to be dealt with. Along with the rest of the world, TSM has been closely following the situation surrounding FTX. We have no insight into the matter other than what has been reported publicly. We are currently consulting legal counsel to determine the next best steps to protect our team, staff, fans and players. Moving on to Riot Games, who are working with Ubisoft on a research project to create more positive gaming communities. This is according to a post on Riot Games' website. The post begins with something very positive. Across the gaming industry, many people are hard at work making gaming a more positive, more inclusive, and ultimately a more fun experience for everyone. Making meaningful change in this complex challenge is going to take collaboration across the gaming industry. That's why Riot and Ubisoft are teaming up on a tech partnership to develop a database gathering in-game data to better train AI-based preemptive moderation tools that detect and mitigate disruptive behavior in-game. Any data gathered that will be able to identify a person will be removed before sharing. They're calling it the Zero Harm in Comms research project, and it's the very first step in a cross-industry project that aims to benefit all people who play video games. Now, both companies are members of the Fair Play Alliance and believe that improving the social dynamics of online games will only come through communication, collaboration, and joint efforts across the gaming industry. I'm interested in how this is going to progress because I'm not too sold on AI moderation tools. I think that there is a lot of scope for them to make mistakes or to, learn the wrong things. One only has to look at those artificial intelligences that were put onto Twitter and within a day or two ended up as Nazis. That said, at least Riot and Ubisoft are trying to do something that can improve the situation because, let's be fair, the trolls have had an upper hand in this game for a long, long time, and if there is something that can automatically moderate what they're doing, then that would be a good thing. I'm just worried that there'll be workarounds for this or that the artificial intelligence will become Captain Censorship. We'll keep an eye on this. Okay, moving on to something a bit more fun. Sony have apparently partnered with NCSoft to make a Horizon MMORPG. It's a game that's said to be in development at the South Korean company behind Lineage and Guild Wars, who have apparently been recruiting developers to work on the title, which is currently listed as Project H. This is apparently part of Sony's push into live service games, but you'll notice there's a lot of apparently and reportedly and things like that because there's no actual confirmation about this. This is one of those things that I think is a hopeful rumour based on things that Guerrilla Games have said. Now, Guerrilla Games, as everyone knows, made Horizon Zero Dawn and Horizon Forbidden West, and they have expressed that they would like to expand Horizon into a multiplayer game, possibly even an MMORPG. The world of Horizon is fascinating, cyber dinosaurs and things like that, and all sorts of lore to explore. Could be an interesting game. We'll watch this space. In other Sony news, they may start tracking the history of in-game digital assets. This is according to an article in GameSoul. Sony Interactive Entertainment may possibly be working on a feature that could supposedly track the distribution of in-game digital assets, such as cosmetics or even gameplay moments, by assigning unique tokens to them. Now, if you're wondering why that sounds vaguely familiar, well, the fact that it used the word token should be a big red flag. They're effectively talking about NFTs. Sony Interactive Entertainment recently published a patent that talked about this particular feature. What it says is that in-game digital assets could potentially track the history of all modifications made, including ownership, visual appearance, or even metadata by generating blocks that contain information about previous records. Players may also be assigned unique tokens to track the history of their actions and/or transactions with other players. This patent also discusses tradable licenses for certain in-game digital assets, such as weapon skins, so that they may be used within the related video game. Apparently, the company wants to decrease fraud between players by making the trade of in-game digital assets as transparent as can be. Now, the interesting thing about this is it kind of highlights what I've been saying about NFTs. There is another way of using NFTs that is actually beneficial to the video games industry, and they're not something that you should be afraid of. The problem is that you have all of the exploitative ones who've come forward first, and now people are shit scared of NFTs and anything involving NFTs. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that you should put your money or trust into NFTs. No way, no how. Not in the current form. They're still in that phase that's basically the Wild West for this particular type of technology, and it will take several more years at least for it to develop into a usable form that is safe and secure and good for the industry. But right now, don't. But I think what Sony are doing with this patent is effectively what I was talking about in the intro, future-proofing themselves to a degree. Speaking of future-proofing, back in September, Sony and Honda decided to join forces and take on Tesla, and they put forward plans to tap into the entertainment prowess of Honda's electric cars. This new company, tentatively titled Sony Honda Mobility, but possibly with a better brand name going forward, they want to use music, movies, and PlayStations to gain an edge over their electric vehicle rivals. Now, Sony's got a very powerful position in terms of the global entertainment industry, and Honda make really good cars. It seems like a match made in heaven, especially as Tesla has entertainment in their vehicles as well. Sony has content, services, and entertainment technologies that move people. We are adapting these assets to mobility, and this is our strength against Tesla. This is according to President Izumi Kawanishi, who has headed Sony's AI robotics business. He goes on to say Tesla is not providing any content services, and adding the PlayStation 5 platform into their cars was technologically possible. I mean, it's a bit of a baller move if they do manage to pull it off, but I also have a lot of concerns because video games at the best of times are a distraction, and having them in a car just seems like an accident waiting to happen. Which is an interesting little segue because next up is Microsoft versus Sony over Activision Blizzard. According to an article that was in the New York Times, where it basically covered all of the history of this and things that are going on, there was a little thing that stood out, and it was that on November the 11th of this year, Microsoft apparently offered Sony a 10-year deal to keep Call of Duty on PlayStation. Sony have apparently declined to comment on this offer. The article itself is quite interesting, and I'm going to link it in the description below. It's not the main thing I want to talk about here about this, but it is interesting as a read-up in the run-in to what I really want to talk about, which is the Verge's Decode podcast from earlier this month. And their guest at that point was Phil Spencer, who was talking about Candy Crush, his development, Call of Duty, PlayStation, regulators, all sorts of stuff. It was a very broad and wide-ranging interview. The Verge have done a transcribed version of it, but they also have the audio version if you want to listen to it. I will link it in the description below. There are some things that you can immediately take away from that interview. Number one is the suggestion by Phil Spencer that Activision Blizzard's financials rely on Call of Duty being available on the Sony PlayStation platform. And that is not just short term, but in the medium term to longer term as well. I think that kind of ties in with Phil Spencer's suggestion that they offered Sony a 10-year contract, possibly as a minimum term. Phil Spencer does say that he is open to Sony and regulators about making sure that Call of Duty continues to be available on PlayStation platforms and other platforms in a way that they want to see. So that's one of the maneuvers that Phil Spencer is pulling with this podcast. There is going to be a lot of maneuvering and jockeying for position between Microsoft and Sony because you do have this as corporate versus corporate. A lot of stuff that they say in interviews and podcasts like this, you have to take with a pinch of salt. There may be some truth to it, but there's going to be a lot of massaging of that truth as well. One of the other big takeaways, again in relation to Call of Duty and PlayStation, is when Phil Spencer says, okay, we're going to continue to ship Call of Duty on PlayStation. I'm totally open to that. No issue at all. This idea that we're going to write a contract that says forever doesn't make sense to any lawyer. There is obviously a business relationship between the royalty exchanges and other things. You're not going to give up any ability to do what you need to do and the flexibility with the business in the future. He goes on to say, when I'm saying things like, as long as there is a PlayStation, there was no implied threat at all. I hope there's a PlayStation forever. I do. I think PlayStation and Nintendo are great for the gaming industry. Hopefully I have been consistent in saying that. All I mean is that at some point you have to have the ability to run your business and not just the console business. It's not about pulling the rug out from underneath the PlayStation 7's legs at some point like, haha, you just didn't write the contract long enough. There's no contract that could be written that says forever. Our model is we want to be where players are, especially with franchises the size of Minecraft and Call of Duty. I'm going to stop talking about the interview with Phil Spencer there because there's a lot more that I could talk about. For example, when he's talking about mobile, he says it's a place where if we don't gain relevancy as a gaming brand over time, the business will become untenable. He also talks about Project Keystone and the price point that he originally wanted for the game streaming device and why it couldn't work, which is why the project was ultimately shelved. If you are interested in the business side of the video games industry, then please do have a listen to the podcast, read that New York Times article, even check out that Newzoo report. Moving on to Nintendo, and according to this article in Kyoto News, Nintendo are being praised for their new rules against customers who harass staff. Apparently, Nintendo updated their customer service terms and conditions to allow them to refuse repairs and replacements to clients who are abusive or who make unreasonable requests to the staff. Users on social media have lauded Nintendo's move to protect consumer-facing employees from harassment by customers. To be honest, I'm actually siding with Nintendo, and I don't say that a lot, but I think that this has become an all-too-common problem. There are any number of people out there who believe, fervently in some cases, that if you shout at or abuse staff members, you will get what you want. That's absolutely not the case. The problem is that the staff members themselves have no real fallback position. It's all too often that the company will eventually give way and side with the customer. That old saying that the customer is always right. Well, a lot of people who've been on the receiving end of that kind of abuse know the customer is a bloody liar as well. Anyway, Nintendo have said, we made the decision after concluding our customers would understand because of the reputation we have built of faithfully responding to them. Now, I would like to see more companies following Nintendo's example because, let's be honest, there are so many occasions where you might have been in a shop or an office or something like that, and you've witnessed this yourself, somebody hurling abuse at a staff member who literally cannot do anything about the situation. They're only there to do one job. Maybe it's just answering the phones, but they're not getting paid to be the victim of that kind of abuse. And it'd be nice if the company can then empower the staff to refuse service to that person. Moving on to Apple, who have plans for a 3D world and video service for their mixed reality headset. This is according to a recent jobs listing which shed light on plans for an upcoming mixed reality headset. Apparently, this is a project that Apple hopes will vault them into a new era of computing, and it's not set to arrive until next year. The headset is likely to be priced between $2,000 and $3,000 because it's a high-end product that will pack a Mac-level M2 chip, more than 10 cameras placed outside and inside the device, and the highest resolution displays ever featured on a mass-market headset. It's going to run a new operating system called Reality OS, and it's going to include mixed reality versions of core Apple apps like Messages, FaceTime, and Maps. I'm fascinated by this because I mentioned Newzoo earlier on about that report that they had about the Chinese state's regulations on the video games industry and the effect that they were having on video game developers and publishers. Well, they also have another report, which is about VR games revenues, which are set to hit $1.8 billion in 2022, and active headset users were going to reach 27.7 million globally, and forecast to hit 46 million in 2024. This is according to Newzoo's VR Games Market Report 2022. According to the report, the VR install base is growing faster than ever, and it's the standalone VR headsets like the Meta Quest that are the reason for this growth. Sony are launching their VR2 headset in February next year, and Apple are working on this new mixed reality headset. I would put good money on Samsung, Huawei, Microsoft, all of them working on some kind of virtual reality system, let's say. Maybe not a headset, maybe a system itself. And the reason for that is because it's a growth industry and it is the future of things like movies and video games, all sorts of other forms of entertainment. I do have an episode of The Big Slice coming out where I will be exploring the current situation when it comes to VR and the possible futures that could occur for it as a technology. Okay, moving on to Crystal Dynamics, who say that they hear fans loud and clear after 100,000 people responded to a survey about a remake of Legacy of Kain. So, back in October, Crystal Dynamics launched a questionnaire which asked players what they'd like to see in a Legacy of Kain series should it make a comeback. And they received over 100,000 responses, which has made Crystal Dynamics sit up and go, hang on a minute. Have we missed out for all these years on the possibility of making money? We've got to sort this out. So yeah, hopefully there is a Legacy of Kain, possibly even a Soul Reaver reboot coming out at some point. Speaking of reboots, Team Ninja have apparently confirmed Ninja Gaiden and Dead or Alive reboot plans, and the studio wants to share more news as soon as possible. This is according to the translation of a talk that the president of Team Ninja, Fumihiko Yasuda, gave during a panel at the G-Star conference in Busan in Korea. Now, apparently Yasuda has publicly stated his desire to revive the Ninja Gaiden franchise on a number of occasions. Even though it's not an official announcement, it does make me hopeful that there is a new Ninja Gaiden game coming very soon. Moving on to the Grammy Awards, and they have revealed their first nominees for a new video game category, and those nominees are Aliens Fireteam Elite by Austin Wintory, Assassin's Creed Valhalla Dawn of Ragnarok by Stephanie Economou, Call of Duty Vanguard by Bear McCreary, Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy by Richard Jack, and Old World by Christopher Tin. The category for the best soundtrack of video games and other interactive media was announced earlier this year, and I am really glad that video game music is finally getting a look in at the award ceremonies, because it has been a wonderful thing and eminently notable. I do think it's a shame that Endwalker isn't in this, because it does have fantastic music as well. There are a couple of other games that had equally fantastic music to the 5 that have been recommended here as nominations, but that's more of a personal choice than anything else. Anyway, moving on to Hideo Kojima, who has stated that he wants to explore creating films and music, and jokingly claims his body is 70% made of movies. Anyone who's played a Hideo Kojima game, especially recently, knows that he has a penchant for the cinematic, a bit like David Cage, but I think Hideo Kojima has more of a flair for narrative and the dramatic than David Cage does. This was a claim that he made while speaking at the Annan Awards in Japan, where he won the top honours in the culture category for his work on Death Stranding. He said that while he's made games his whole career, all fields are connected in digital works, so I would like to expand from games to fields such as music and film. I seriously doubt Kojima is pursuing an actual career change. I think this is more he wants to get things off his chest. These are things that he would love to accomplish as life goals rather than full-on careers. It's more his bucket list than anything else. The reason I say that is because there is a big difference between directing a film and directing a video game. Our penultimate story is about Lionsgate and Streets of Rage. They've picked up the rights for the Sega video game, and they want to make a movie of it, with the writing being done by John Wick's Derek Kolstad. Ironically, given the nature of game that Streets of Rage is, I think this could possibly work. I think Derek Kolstad has done an amazing job with John Wick, and I think that the Streets of Rage format is a format he could really use and do something interesting with it. Anyway, our final story. PETA, you know, that crazy organisation that's all about protecting animals and not people, they want God of War Ragnarok to have a PETA mode to avoid violence against animals. Because apparently if you're being attacked by 50 wolves and torn apart by them, they want you to sit down and take it. You're not allowed to fight back because, oh, woe is the animals. It feels like PETA kind of missed the point of God of War Ragnarok, but them's the breaks. You can't please everyone. I know it's kind of a stupid story, but I wanted to end on something ridiculous and silly because it's been a long episode today, and if you've stuck with me this far, then your head is probably just as battered as mine. Let us know what you think about all the stories that I've covered in the comments below. I'm always interested in finding out what people think. I'll be back on the next episode of Gossip News or on The Big Slice, whichever comes out first. Until then, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and look after yourselves.